Now the EA UFC games have the positives and they have the many negatives, with most of those negatives being more noticeable when comparing these games to the old UFC Undisputed games by THQ and Ukes. I've done a few videos showing what these games did better than EA UFC, but now I want to actually go back to each UFC Undisputed game and talk a little bit about them all. So let's go back, way back, even further than when UFC Undisputed began, to a time where your average UFC video game would look more like this.
Are you ready? Let's rock and roll.
UFC games around this time resembled more of a arcade fighter type game, with health bars like a Street Fighter or Tekken video game. The UFC games weren't bad or anything, they were pretty enjoyable actually, but they lacked any kind of true feeling of what a UFC fight was. Most of the time, the fights would be over in a minute or two. I don't think I had a fight that went to a decision once at all. As time went on, other sports video games like FIFA and Fight Night, for example, were making big leaps forward to becoming accurate simulations of the actual sports you saw on TV. The presentation, the graphics, the gameplay, they were all heading in a new direction that led the next generation of sports video games. UFC games, in my mind, were starting to feel like they were stuck in the past and were not really progressing like other sports games at the time were. UFC would release their last video game in 2004. And would not release another game for another 5 years. During that time, the UFC would go from doing decently well to exploding in popularity, due to a combination of the Ultimate Fighter, the addition of Brock Lesnar bringing in new fans from the WWE, and the rise of pay-per-view draws like GSP and Anderson Silva. With UFC now exploding in popularity, it would only make sense to get a new video game out there to capitalise on the influx of new fans, along with combat sports video games doing huge numbers at the time, with Fight Night Round 3 selling close to 6 million copies worldwide.
The sponsor of today's video is Raid Shadow Legends. Raid Shadow Legends is a console-level experience game that you can play on your phone. It includes hundreds of artifacts to equip and well over 600 champions, each with their own unique skills. Build your team, level your champions, and play Raid your way. What I personally like most about Raid Shadow Legends is the incredible number of champions that you can obtain in the game, each with their own unique look and skills that you can use on the battlefield. I mean, just look at the champions I'm showing right now, and there's many, many more that you can find in Raid Shadow Legends. There's so much going on in Raid this month. There's going to be 5 new champions added to the game. There's an overhaul of the Champions Vault, and there's going to be all kinds of small updates on top of that too. On top of that, Raid will be running a huge series of Summer Splash events for the entire month, where you can get your hands on amazing skins for the Dwarf Trunder. Oh, and one last thing, make sure you get in now if you want to be a part of it.
Ultimate Death Night, coming August 2022.
Now is the best time to start on Raid, so make sure you go to the description, click the link, or scan my QR code that you see on the screen. Once you've done that, you'll get $30 worth of rewards. This includes a free epic champion called Aina, 200,000 silver, 1 energy refill, and 1 XP boost, and 1 ancient shard, so you can summon awesome champions as soon as you get in the game. All your treasure will be waiting for you right here, but hurry, because the rewards will only be here for the next 30 days, and for new players only. I'll see you all on Raid Shadow Legends.
In early 2007, it was announced that the UFC would be working with THQ on a new UFC video game, with longtime WWE Games developer Ukes being the developer of these new UFC games. In June 2008, it was announced that the game would be called UFC 2009 Undisputed, which was the actual name of the game, not UFC Undisputed 2009, but that does sound better anyway, so I'll just stick to that. UFC Undisputed 2009 was originally targeted for a early 2009 release date, but that would get pushed to May 2009. THQ put out a downloadable demo about a month before release. The idea of doing a demo was incredibly smart, as the demo was extremely popular on PS3 and Xbox 360. The demo's popularity not only helped make the actual game sell really well, but I've seen people say that the demo made them become fans of the actual UFC. So getting into UFC Undisputed 2009 now, you could tell that this was something much different to before. The presentation first of all is so on point with this game. You've got licensed arenas, multiple refs to choose from, Bruce Buffer in the octagon doing the announcements, the tail of the tape, and even commentary from Joe Rogan and Mike Goldberg, with Joe Rogan in particular sounding very excited to be able to tell the player that WWE is fake when playing as Brock Lesnar.
Sometime doing fake wrestling that, people kind of underestimate him. Real money for him was in fake wrestling, but he is a real fighter.
Now with a 2022 perspective, the game definitely feels aged, as I've been playing a lot of UFC Undisputed 3. And by playing it so much, it made it so much noticeable how much was missing in comparison. But I can definitely still appreciate everything that the game managed to do at the time, especially after playing some of those early era UFC games. The stand-up definitely felt more brutal than ever in Undisputed 2009, whilst also being more realistic in that you just can't punch and kick like crazy without draining a ton of stamina, something which you could do in those old games. Damage was another big positive and a major step up from those previous games. In Undisputed 2009, you could get realistic swelling from taking too much damage, along with cuts that would cause the octagon to be stained with blood. The swelling in particular is something I'd go as far as saying is much better in Undisputed 2009 than in the current EA UFC games. The ground game in Undisputed 2009 was also majorly improved. In early UFC games, you could just instantly get mount most of the time. There was hardly any actual positions once you got on the ground. In 09, there's multiple positions you can obtain, and you really have to work to get into the full mount position. Ground and pound feels as damaging as it should be, and can eventually lead to a TKO without the fighter going out. Speaking of knockouts, they are super satisfying to get in this game. You'll always see the mouthpiece go flying, and I always remember trying to get the mouthpiece to fly as far as possible, and even trying to get it to go out of the cage. But yeah, the knockouts compared to the older games are just on another level, and the KO is not always dependent on whether you've done enough damage, or in previous games' cases, emptied the opponent's health bar. You could just get caught with a great shot, and that is it for you. It was totally possible to get something crazy like a 4-second knockout. The roster contains 80 different fighters in UFC Undisputed 2009, which obliterates any previous UFC games roster, with the usual roster count being around 30 to 40 fighters. There's multiple weights to choose from, and pretty much every big fighter from that era in those 5 divisions are in the game. The 2 biggest negatives of the game for me are the lack of modes in the game, and the submission system is pretty terrible. To get submissions, you simply have to rotate the analog stick. There's no real indication that the submission is close, and it feels completely unresponsive to the rotation inputs. I've seriously broken multiple PS3 controllers' R3 buttons because of that damn submission system. The modes, outside of having straight up fights locally or online, are just career mode and a classic fights mode. The classic fights mode, whilst sounding like a great idea, is executed poorly, with the only original content being that you get a pre-fight video talking about the classic fight. The fight that happens itself is just a normal matchup, but you have to win exactly how that fight ended. So if the classic fight ended by round 3 knockout, then you'll have to get a round 3 knockout. This version of the mode lacks the depth that the future UFC games would have. Career mode is also just kind of thrown together with not much depth. You just simply climb the rankings with a bit of sparring thrown in there in between fights. You'll also get sponsor offers that will earn you more in-game currency, and every now and then you might get an offer to switch opponents or do something to build your profile, like a fan signing. But other than that, there's not much more to it. I think it's a case just like Classic Fights mode, where I have played the better version of the modes in UFC Undisputed 3, so I'm likely just being a little bit more tougher with that perspective. Overall, UFC Undisputed 2009 remains a classic, and a classic that kicks off a new era, not only for the UFC video games, but UFC as a whole. Undisputed 2009 would go on to sell 3.5 million copies worldwide, and the sequel was announced before the end of 2009 for release in May 2010. But despite 09 being a hot seller and UFC doing the best it's ever done, UFC Undisputed 2010 would not share that same success, and in my opinion, would become one of the most underrated UFC games ever made. In the next video, I'll be taking a look back at UFC Undisputed 2010 and talk about why I felt it was so underrated as a UFC video game. Thanks everyone for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.